Hi, my name's Christopher. I'm the founder and director of Musical U, and welcome to Musicality Now. Have you ever been frustrated or disappointed with your music practice? Maybe you felt like there's just never enough time, or you don't seem to make any progress, even when you do find the time and put in the work. If you've ever wondered what lets some musicians achieve the highest levels of worldwide success, while others remain forever a struggling hobbyist, it's not down to talent, and it's not purely about putting in the work. Science has shown over the last few decades that so-called talent is almost entirely a myth, and there are actually very specific practical things that can make a dramatic difference in how fast anybody learns a skill, including in music. Despite that research, almost no music learners are actually able to put that into practice and get the benefits. I'm joined today by the learning coach, Gregg Goodhart. Gregg has been a guest on the show before, so I won't give a full intro here. You can find a link to his past interview in the show notes for this episode at musicalitynow.com. Suffice to say, I consider Gregg to be the world's leading expert on how to apply all of the latest scientific research and understanding of how the brain learns to practical knowledge and skill acquisition, including in music. Gregg, say a quick hi if you would.
Hi, it's great to be here with you.
We've been working with Gregg on a brand new and unique course designed to help any music learner shift into high gear in their learning simply by adjusting the way they practice. As part of preparing that course, we surveyed our audience to learn about their experiences with music practice. And across several hundred responses, there were a handful of really common and painfully frustrating sticking points that came through. I read through each and every one of those responses personally, and I can tell you I felt your pain on a visceral level. I can relate from my own experience to that frustration, that struggle, and that feeling of self-doubt or even inadequacy that comes up when you feel like you're just not seeing the results from your music practice that you expected to. So I've invited Gregg to come on the show today and share his insights on how to tackle each of these big sticking points. We're going to talk about what to do if you feel like there's just never enough time for practicing music. We're going to talk about how to get the biggest bang for your buck, how to make the most of the music practice time you do have. We're going to talk about how to break through any problem or sticking point you might encounter in your music learning, how to stay motivated and interested and keep up a consistent practice habit, and how to always feel clear about how you should be spending your practice time. If you're like most music learners, then you are ready and willing to put in the time and energy required to improve. But at the same time, you probably wish there was a way to make sure you were doing it right and would get the maximum payoff from the effort you do put in. As you're about to discover, that payoff can actually be several times greater than what you've probably seen in the past, even at your very best. Shifting your practicing into high gear like we're going to be talking about today, you just might discover you have a lot more apparent talent than you ever thought possible. So without further ado, let's dive into the big questions and challenges that came up in that survey and get some expert insights on what we can do to get better results faster. So if I had to name the number one point of frustration for people that came through in our survey, it was, I don't have enough time. I can't find enough time. I can't seem to make the time. I can't keep up putting in the time. And one fascinating thing was that we also asked people how much time they were spending. And I was shocked to see just how consistent it is. And keep in mind, we have some teachers, we have some pros in these survey responses, but for the most part, they're amateurs of one stripe or another, hobbyists, people who are passionate about music, but it's not their full-time gig. We had answers across the spectrum from 5 minutes a day to 5 minutes a week to 2 hours a day. And no matter how much time people were spending, they were saying they did not have enough time. So Gregg, how is this possible that however much time we seem to put into music practice, it always feels like there's not enough time or we're not getting the results we thought we would from that time?
Well, it's natural to feel that way when you have lots of things that are putting demands on your time. Your mind has all these open loops that it's trying to close, and we don't particularly close them. One helpful way for me, I taught private Catholic school for many years, and there were kids on the football team, and they were on the debate team, and they were in AP classes, and they would tell me they didn't have time for practice. And I'd say just fill out a time inventory, not with specifics of what you're doing, that I go to school here, I do football here. Just black all that stuff out. Black every half hour that you're obligated, even if it's just meeting my friends down at the park every Saturday to shoot some hoops. And then inevitably, what we found is you start closing that open loop of scheduling and you see your schedule from afar. And we'd always find, no matter how busy they were, we'd always find these white spots. Now, I was dealing with high school kids. But when I'd say, geez, what are you doing with those white spots there? There's a couple hours. We're not even looking at the weekend. There's a couple hours. And the answer was almost always, I don't know, texting. And the truth is that we do have more windows in which, and no, it's not, I'm going to find 15 minutes between the other 12, 15 hours I'm working. It's not that. We do have little windows. So that's the first thing. The second is, how are you using that time? There should definitely be no one who's practicing 2 hours a day who's not making progress. And it's what you're doing in that time. But even short little bursts of practice, and I think most people will be amazed if you manage it right, if you put the right things into your practice, starting with just 10 minutes, finding that 10-minute time will get you much better at things within 5 days or so. That's usually the plan that I use. And that will create motivation to do more. One of the reasons we think we don't have time when we practice is we tend to think, especially if we're older and dedicated and really want to do something, I've got to find 30, 60, 90 minutes here because I'm going to buckle down and get it done. That's very hard to get started. What we're talking about there is something in your brain called orienting selective attention, going from what you were doing to what you are doing. And the harder the task it is that you're going to undertake, the harder it is to actually do that. So if you reduce the time and say, I will be perfectly satisfied with 5 minutes of practice 5 days a week or 10 minutes of practice, that itself won't be enough. And your natural reaction is going to be, oh, that's not going to work. I'm not even going to start. However, if you put the right things in that time and really manage the way the brain learns, you will begin to notice improvement, which will make you look forward, and there's science on this, make you look forward to doing more practicing. So it really, I think finding the time might not be as hard as people think. It's not being willing to put in 5 or 10 minutes because we think it's worthless. You can really, and this isn't well, if you do it for a month, you'll get it. Within a matter of days, you will notice how much better you get if you apply things like deliberate practice.
And I know that for myself, it's certainly the case that I can spend 2 hours wasted notionally doing music practice, or if I really put my mind to it, I can make a lot of headway in just 10 or 15 minutes, but you need to know the right way to do it. So if it's not a matter of just having enough time, what are we meant to be doing in that time? If it's true that we can make progress in just 10 or 15 minutes a day, how do you spend that 10 or 15 minutes in order to get the results we're talking about?
Well, the good news is, and this is especially true when working in small periods of time, is that learning is simple. It's just not easy. The simple part is a 3-step process I use to represent the idea of deliberate practice, which is the way all high efficiency learning works. And please, I encourage people to just look up deliberate practice and read about K. Anders Ericsson's works since his first publication on the process in 1993. It's a 3-step process. You make a plan. Think about doing repetitions. You make a plan. I'm going to work on this measure. You do it, and then you reflect, what could I do better? It is that simple. Well, maybe my finger went to the wrong place. It went too far to the left. Next time I'll go try too far to the right. It's kind of like watching a child learn to walk. And then the next time I went too far, and eventually you end up where you are. However, it does become a little bit more labor intensive when the reflect piece is, I'm not sure what to do there. And I think that's where a lot of people end up. You get to a point where you plateau and you don't know what to do next. In this area, cognitive science is extremely helpful. The answers very varied depending on the situation and the student at any given time. It could be we need to apply contextual interference, which is the miracle plateau breaker. It could be an issue of mindset, what I call Carol Dweck's work on what I call why humans can't get out of their own way when it comes to learning. Once you start to see, oh, it's because of how I felt about doing this, and you put it in perspective. It could simply be understanding why accuracy is important and how neural networks are built in the brain. It could be building certain bits of self-control in your prefrontal cortex. It could be many, and even any of those, for instance, when I say contextual interference, that has a good 30, 40 strategies underneath that heading too, which then need to be taught in their own right. So yes, it is very simple. Apply deliberate practice, but it is not easy because you will have to go looking for answers. And that's why I've kind of gotten into what I'm doing. The art of teaching really is where and when with people do you apply what? And the art of that is putting everything in the right place at the right time so the progression happens so that as deliberate practice continues, you are never left without an answer in the reflect stage. Because Becoming good or great is simply about solving the problem in front of you. Don't worry about 16 problems or where I'm going to be. Can I perform? Can I, as the great jazz pianist Bill Evans says, approximating the product. Don't worry about approximating the product. You're learning. The person you see doing the product was there right with you at one time, the exact same place. They had to go through it. There was no miracle jump. So don't worry about approximating the product. Find the solution to the problem in front of you. And that happens by using deliberate practice and having access to the best science-based information.
Tremendous. I feel like I should go back and record an extra segment for our interview with Professor Anders Ericsson and our episode about deliberate practice to point out it's not your fault if you try doing deliberate practice and you struggle. As you say, like it really came through in the survey results. People have heard of this, they can kind of get the idea, but then they just get stuck trying to apply it and they don't know how to do that reflect stage, or they can't figure out how to do the next iteration of the loop. So I think it's really valuable for them to know there are specific strategies to apply in that situation.
If I may, there is a huge gap between the research and actual practice. And there is enough Dunning-Kruger to go around on both sides. The Dunning-Kruger effect, which says the less you know about something, the less you'll realize you're doing it wrong. People, and I want to say this correctly, people in the research field are very proud of their work and should be. It's amazing. But they think it's the be-all, end-all. Sure, deliberate practice is everything, if you have all the right information. He's studying people who are going to the best music conservatories, going to lessons with some of the best teachers. So when he finds deliberate practice, of course it works with all that information. There is a great gap in researchers explaining what needs to be done in a way people understand and understanding the other elements besides their research that's necessary. On the other side, teachers are not trained. Our schools of education are separated from cognitive science. Teachers are not trained in this. The best most teachers do is they see some report on on the news about try this or that, and we try a little bit of it, but we don't do enough, and we don't know the big picture of learning how it works. A great example of this is Carol Dweck's mindset work, which I think is crucial, and hers is one of the top 3 books I recommend for people to read about learning. I will say I'm aware that there are issues with replication going on now. I've read the divergent opinions. I'm very comfortable recommending mindset still at this point. Anyway, she has this kind of, if you'll just stick with it, if you won't get frustrated, you'll get it. And one of the complaints is, well, she's not accounting for what it is you're doing during that time. She takes for granted and doesn't realize, and I love her work, and doesn't realize that that's not enough. It's not. You need to be doing deliberate practice. You need to have the right information. You need to know what contextual interference is. And this is a wide, wide gap that and I'm now in it, and I can't find anyone else here because I'm looking for friends in this area. And it's something that I think is the great revolution in teaching now. This idea that some people can study music and get good and some can't. Some people can study math and get A's and some get C's, and bless their heart, they all tried. No, they didn't all do it the same way. And this is very nuanced. So a lot of this is, if you say, I found deliberate practice and I'm trying it. For instance, did you know the plan, do, reflect model? Ericsson never talks about that. I came up with that to explain it. And I'll tell you, when I went to Florida State and did a residency there, he showed up at one of my lectures. And as I got to that slide, I realized he didn't do this, I did. I'm like, oh my gosh, I hope he, anyway, we talked later and he said it was a fine representation and he endorsed it, he was fine with it. But it's this explaining of it. It never occurred to him to explain it in a simple 3-step process. And it's that where there's a great lack and need in education. And it is in there that people experience working, but not making progress.
One thing that came up time and time again in this survey was I make progress for a little bit, but then there's just some thing I can't crack, or I can never get my fingers around this passage, or there's this technique, no matter what I do, my body doesn't do the right thing, or my brain can't keep up. There's some kind of plateau or sticking point people hit. What can you do in that situation?
Well, once again, the science gives us answers. There's something in the research called the power law of practice, and this applies to academics and everything else. And what it shows, and I think all of us have experienced this, myself included, and I know the pain of working and working and working and not getting it. I went all the way through graduate school and a performance degree on my instrument before I figured this out. The power law shows that each repetition is slightly less effective than the previous repetition. Now, I don't think it takes an expert in math, which I am not one at all, to understand that if you keep losing, you're going to get, as it gets up, you're going to get less and less and less. And they have a curve. They've actually studied this, and it shows this power law curve as far as improvement, 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 less improvement, less improvement, less improvement. And this indeed is the dreaded plateau that most musicians experience. It's expressed in the literature. Sometime later, there was a paper done called The Power Law Applies to Strategy and Task. What that meant is, if you take what you're doing and then figure out a way to challenge it to do it slightly different, basically vary the context, which is a little more complex than it sounds, you can reset the power law. So when you experience this plateau, you can go right back to the beginning and get the same gains again and again and again. That particular paper was on contextual interference, which is amazing. I've called it the steroids of practicing music with no bad side effects. And once you learn to apply that, which some of the exercises are easier, but it really is a complex thing, a complex, nuanced theory, because the exercises become less effective, then you have to put exercises in. But once you do that, you can break plateaus left and right. There are other ways to do it besides contextual interference, but the answers are clearly in the science. And that's what I do. For instance, if you see my practice classes online, and I've done several with Musical U, people show up having struggled with something for a long period of time. And sure enough, in 20 minutes, 25 minutes, we make it so it's faster, cleaner, and easier to play. And that's really crucial. It's better, faster, and usually we're struggling, pushing at the edge. Instead, it feels much easier. This is possible for anyone. This is just the way the brain works, and it's in the literature. Yet it requires doing something that actually looks like you're getting worse to get better. And I would encourage people to watch the practice class videos to see how this works. And then it's just a matter of, I want to caution people, it's not, oh, I'll do that exercise, because certain exercises work in certain places for certain situations. It's where you are in the learning process that you do that exercise. And what is very powerful is understanding the why and how of why these things work. Then you don't just follow the exercise, you actually internalize what the exercise is trying to do, and you can make it your own and come up with your own strategies, which is what I always encourage in my teaching, to get rid of me at some point, please, and start doing it on your own. And to do that, it's not enough to drive the car. You need to know how the car is built to have a great car. And in practicing, we're generally driving the car, doing little bits of maintenance to keep it going down the road, hoping. What you really want to learn about is every aspect of how the car is built to then have a great car. Now, you can't do that. The driver can't be the mechanic. That's what I do. I'm the mechanic. I give you enough information about the mechanics that you can then drive the car and win the race.
I love that metaphor, and this is definitely one of those things in music education where I just wish I could implant it in every music learner's brain at the click. Because, if you understand that power law of diminishing returns and you realize there is a strategy, there is a set of techniques you can use to bust through that and kind of reset the clock, that's huge. Because if you look through these survey responses, the number of people that are just feeling so down on themselves because they can't crack this thing, or many saying, they're losing their enthusiasm, or they're wondering if they should even keep going. And to know that you can bust through that with a very practical step-by-step methodology is killer.
And it's 100% effective. That's why I feel comfortable walking on stage, whether I'm at a great school like the performance program at Florida State University, there's videos of that, or Indiana University, or whether I'm in an inner city school with kids who don't get that much attention. I'm never afraid. I never know what instrument I'm going to see. I never know what music I'm going to see. Sometimes it's fiddle tunes. Sometimes it's someone playing Rush or the Beatles on guitar. Many times it's people doing the Elgar Concerto or the Haydn Trumpet Concerto. It doesn't matter. It's 100% effective in skill development all the time, and it always works. To know that's out there is very liberating.
Absolutely. One thing that really hit me in the heart reading through these responses was about enthusiasm and motivation, and people who were clearly passionate about their hobby, passionate enough to spend 5-10 minutes writing survey responses for us about their music practice. They would be talking in terms of blaming themselves and getting very down on themselves about not following through with practice. You know, I should be doing this much, or if only I could keep at it, or I'm lazy, or if I just had the discipline. And definitely seeing it as I must put in this work every day and I'm not doing it, therefore I'm bad. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about motivation and what people can do to help themselves feel enthusiasm and eagerness to practice rather than it always feeling like this burden that they have to do.
Well, it's very, very hard to continue with the bucket inside of the boat getting the water out when the boat is sinking much faster than you can bucket the water out. And you get less and less enthusiastic as the boat goes down. And at some point you say, I just accept my fate. The boat is going down. But that's not what has to happen at all. In fact, there's a misunderstanding out there that I think many people believe. I think some teachers believe. I've heard it expressed as where there is enthusiasm, there is achievement. It's actually the opposite. Where there is achievement, there is enthusiasm. And small ways, such as applying contextual interference, that's why I do that in practice classes. When you realize in a few minutes, when I say not 3 minutes, but 10 or 15, when you realize that in a few minutes, you can become insanely better than you've been able to do with months of practice, that provides a whole lot of motivation. I'll give you an example from the research. There's a researcher, I believe he did this in the UK, Barry J. Zimmerman, and I'd be happy to share this information with anybody, who did a study. And he took two groups of women, and I believe he went to a pub, and it was dart throwing. And he took one group to throw darts and just said, figure it out, enjoy yourself, figure it out. I don't think they were drinking at the pub, because that would not that you shouldn't have a good time, but that would
I don't think
would
you know the
skew the
rules of darts in the UK. If you don't have a pint in the other hand, it doesn't count.
Yeah, no pints in your hand when you're practicing. And so anyway, he had one group just try, and of course they improved a little, and they had an okay time. Then he had another group specifically follow, and who wants to learn darts that way? Specifically follow instructions, where they were shown by someone who knew what to do and what to teach. Do this, do that, hold it this way, throw it that way. At the end of and these women had no interest in darts whatsoever. They did not like it. They had no desire. And so they knew they were doing experiments, and they participated. What he found that happened consistently was the group that got better through instruction very much wanted not only to play darts because they had increased their skill, they wanted to learn more. They didn't just want to play with the skill they had. They wanted more of the tedious, hold your dart this way sort of thing and do it 5 times in a row. They wanted more of that instruction because they felt internally the results of that. It's one thing to practice and practice. Again, I've called this the play and pray method, where we go into our practice and we just aren't sure what to do and we hope we get results. And you know what? Sometimes 3 days later, we can play something. And a lot of times we can't. I don't know how I admire all the people who somehow stay motivated and keep looking when you can't find the answers. Imagine what happens when you can find the answers. And that's what the research shows. And as I say, where there is achievement, there is interest. So once you start to achieve, so it's a small hump. It just takes a little bit. If you look at my practice classes, 20 or 25 minutes, a small hump to do that. When you realize that every minute of your practice doesn't have to be a mystery, it can be a problem solved, and you can guarantee that you'll get to the next place. That creates motivation like crazy. What will happen if you have trouble getting yourself to practice? And I'm sure we may talk about that. If you have problems getting yourself to practice, there are ways to go about doing that, such as working on orienting selective attention. But one of the reasons is because you're not getting out of it what you want. And and the only reason I stayed with it is because I'm stubborn. And I just wouldn't stop, even though, as many of us feel, the universe is telling me, sir, you don't have talent. Any reasonable person would give up by now. Just be happy you can go get a job being a teacher and stop trying to be so good. And that's what the universe will tell you. That's what it feels like. When we flip that feeling to, oh my gosh, my capabilities are far more than I thought. And the reason I believe this is because I actually did something I could never do before. And it looks like there are solutions for everything. And then when that solution runs out, it turns out there's another solution on top of that. Your practice minutes will increase without you knowing. What happens is you enter into a flow state. We've all been there, where you work on something, whether it's practice or a woodworking project or whatever, or working on your free throws in basketball, whatever it may be, where we do it and we think it's been 10 minutes and we look up and it's been 50 minutes or an hour. That is the highest state of learning. And there's a researcher, his name's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, spelled just like it sounds. His name is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he's spent his career figuring out what that is. How do you get into that state where learning is actually, you're wrapped up in it so much? He calls it flow. And what it is you have to gain some skill first, and then your skill navigates the problems like this. My skill is better, now my skill is worse. Now my skill is better. To get there, you have to acquire some basic skill where there's achievement. Then there is interest, you enter into flow. And this is totally creatable if you follow the right process.
It's so fascinating. And I think without that insight about how to break through the problems, so many people are left, number one, their motivation wanes as their progress stalls, and then it's just a negative spiral. But number two, I think even with good teaching, if you can't crack the problem, you just move on to something else, right? Like the teacher doesn't want the student to get demotivated, so if they're not finally getting their bar chords right, let's just do something else for a while. And learning music, for me, certainly for a decade plus, it felt like let's just jump to the next thing and hope it's a bit easier. And one of the things that really came out in the survey was overwhelm. And, in the age of the internet more than any other time, I'm sure, we feel like there are 17 different things we should be working on, and we should do our scales and our arpeggios and our fingering and this passage, and we should prepare for that recital, and we should make sure we do a bit of this and a bit of that. And people were asking again and again, how can I know what to practice? If I'm going to set aside this time and I'm going to give it my all, should I be doing 4 things in each session, 3 things? Is it better to just work on repertoire for a month? And, endless options and combinations. How can we all know how best to spend our practice time?
Well, I always call it meeting the student where they're at. For instance, I use an example. If you write on the board, to be or not to be, and you say, that's Shakespeare. And the student looks at the board and, okay, have you ever heard of Shakespeare? No. Okay. Can you read this sentence? No. Okay. Do you know what words are? No. Okay. Do you know the alphabet? Yes. It's time to make sure you know the alphabet and start learning how to form words. Stop trying to read Shakespeare. And then I know the reaction to that is, great, you're going to tell me I have to do stuff, little teeny things I don't like, so that in a year maybe I can play a song. No, what actually happens is what's keeping you from playing the songs you want are all the little teeny things that aren't working for you. When you start taking care of one of them, you will immediately get better at everything you play. So I used to really drill down with kids. Where's your finger going? Check that. And there's a process of deliberate practice, which is this plan, do, reflect thing, where you reflect every time. How much do we reflect when we're practicing? Do we really pay attention to where the finger is? Or do we just accept that the sound is good enough to approximate the song and move on? So that's what's going on. So what you want to fill your practice with, especially if you're trying to build practice time, just a little bit of time working on 1 or 2 small technical things. If you'll do this for about 10 minutes a day for about 5 days, the results will be so significant and your playing will improve so much. No, you will not become a virtuoso in 5 days. But what will happen is these start to get out of the way between your brain, your heart, and your instrument. I don't like these. They are my enemy. I've fought with them all my life because I want them to do things that my brain and heart want to come out of the instrument.
And sorry, Greg, for the benefit of our audio listeners, I should mention you're wiggling your fingers there.
These, my hands, I'm sorry. And when you start working on the smallest areas that you think are meaningless, but let's face it, they're not, because your fingers aren't going where you want them to go, right? So doesn't it make sense to start training the fine motor skills? When you start to do that, the fingers start to move out of the way. The hands start to move out of the way of your intentions, and they obey your intentions instead of resist them. When that starts to happen, even in the smallest areas, things that you've been working on for a long time, I'm not saying you'll perfect them, but they will get much better. And that's where the whole idea of actually achieving things, creating motivation, when that starts to happen in the smallest way, and I can pretty much guarantee these type of results if you do it correctly with 10 minutes a day, 5 days a week. No, you're not going to become a virtuoso doing that for years, but that will create the foundation from which you can play things you couldn't play before, and will create massive motivation. Because let's face it, folks, you're not motivated because you're not getting what you want. As soon as you start to get what you want, the motivation will go through the roof. And if you start to get 10 times more, not than you want, but that you thought you could ever do, oh my gosh, you won't be able to, you'll have a hard time staying in bed in the morning. And I had this experience when I figured this out, where it was a summer and I didn't have to be at class or work or anything. And I was trying to sleep in the morning when I had started figuring this out. And I couldn't stay in bed because I would be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm probably a half hour away from finishing this section. And I would have to pull myself out of bed to go do it. And that's how much enthusiasm. And I've been through this, even though I have music degrees, I've been through this, the play and pray, not knowing. And boy, when that happened, I was surprised when I couldn't sleep more when I wanted to, and forced myself out of bed. And that's how much motivation it provides.
Amazing. I'm sure that sounds like a dream come true for a lot of people who are grinding away at their practice, to genuinely feel that enthusiasm to get back to their instrument on a consistent basis over time. And I want to just underscore something there, because based on everything that was said in the survey, I know a lot of people will have been expecting the answer to that question to sound something like, well, spend 10 minutes on scales, and then you must make sure you do bars 1 through 10 of each of your 3 pieces, and then you must do this other thing. Because that's so much of what we hear. When we have a good teacher, they tell us what to practice, and it sounds like that kind of minute-by-minute schedule a lot of the time. But your answer wasn't prescriptive in that way. It was much more generalizable and personalizable than that, I think.
Going down to the very basics. What is it your fingers are doing that you don't want them to do? If every time I go to, play a scale passage, several of the notes are muted, then let's work on that, whatever it is. In fact, if you're studying with a private teacher of your instrument, my advice would be just go ask them, what are the two, if he or she had, you said, I will do anything you want, and I don't care about playing music or anything. What 2 things would you like me to work on? I can almost imagine, well, your finger placement's a little bit off. We've been talking about it every week, but I let it go because you want to play entire songs because you think that that's the more motivation. Okay, let's work just on your finger placement for 5 minutes. And you know what? The way you're holding the pick or the bow, you have to change your pinky here, and you're not doing that because to do that would take away from learning the whole song, which you're not learning. So if you fix those 2 little things, then you can learn the song more easy. So it's prescriptive in that you want to break it down to something that you'd like to do a little bit better. But no, it's not like one of those you have to play scales for this amount of time and arpeggios for that amount of time.
And I think, again, that's quite liberating, right? Because if you're given that recipe, as it were, you're always going to be second guessing it a bit and wondering, should I adjust this or do that? Whereas taking this kind of problem solving mentality to it, I think makes everything approachable, and you realize it doesn't really matter if you do it this way or that way, or focus more on this week and so on.
It makes it so simple. That's the thing, make it simple. And if you think about it, the brain cannot multitask. If anyone thinks they can read the research on this, I'm not going to go into it, but the brain can't multitask. And when we're trying to learn a song before we've developed 5 or 10 skills that we need to do the song isn't going to happen. So the idea that we just take care of one problem at a time is simple. How hard it is to play an entire song, how easy it is to just check that my finger's in the right place. And then another one, just check my finger's in the right place. Before you know it, that 5 minutes is melted off the clock because you will be involved in flow, constant problem solving. Before you know it, the timer goes off and the 10 minutes are up. Before you know it, 5 days are up and everything is working better. And now you're sold on this idea. But to piggyback on what you were saying, it's incredibly simple to do. And it's not that hard to get going. It'll become harder when your motivation is so massive that you want to do 2 hours a day and hit 5 different areas. That's great. We can build up to that. It's always simple, though. It's always about solving whatever the problem is. And you just drill down until you find what the problem is, and then you build up from there. And once you learn and you say, well, geez, I don't know everything about my instrument. Well, you can get that type of instruction is out there. It's how you go about doing it. And you'll figure it out on your own. This doesn't work. I'll work on just that. That doesn't work. I'll work on just that. And it's how you work on it. Pay attention to the small details. You will become engrossed in that because there will always be a question answer going on in your mind. Before you know it, 5 days is up and you're a lot more motivated because you're getting results.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Greg. As I went through these survey responses, I was really glad I was going to be able to call you in to address some of them because the pain and frustration and needless suffering, to put it bluntly, that is going on in the world of music learning, it really makes me itch to do something about it. And I know no one better than you to help with that. I sometimes say if I could just wave a magic wand and put this in people's heads, and I think everything we've covered today falls in that category. But it's as you say, it's simple, but it's easier said than done. And so that's why we're collaborating now on this new course together. And I couldn't be more excited because for everything we do in musicality training at Musical U, we kind of wave our hand at instrument technique and say, oh yeah, all of the talentism stuff applies there too. And you could get very, very good at your instrument if you just knew the right things to do. For the first
Right.
time, we're actually tackling that question, which I find super exciting, and doubly so because we have you teaching the course, Greg. Any final parting words of wisdom for our audience today?
I know there are so many tools out there and so much information. In this day and age, it's very easy to find. And even if you're able to find all the good information, I know how hard it is to know when to apply it, where to apply it, and how it works. This can be very frustrating. And in fact, that's why we're doing this course, to cut through all of that and get right to what works, when it works, and how it works. And whether you join us for the course or not, I would really encourage you to just look into the small areas of science, look for the small things you can improve through deliberate practice, and try to become a much more enthusiastic, which you can, a much more enthusiastic practicer and musician. Whether we can help you with that or not, it would be great if you just tried that stuff.
100%. Well, I think you said in our past interview, Greg, something like, we're both in it for the right reasons. We believe in that mission, and we certainly do. As you say, whether you join us for the course or not, we just wholeheartedly encourage you to explore this stuff because it can help pretty much every single one of the frustrations that came up in this survey. So if you're feeling like you're not making enough practice, if you don't have enough time, if your motivation's waning, it's not your fault. It's not that you lack talent. It's not that you're not disciplined enough. It's that the way you're approaching practice is not what it could be. And if you transform it in the ways we've been talking about today, you will be astonished at the results you can get and the increased motivation, satisfaction, fulfillment, all that good stuff that starts to happen in your musical life. If you're watching this episode as it airs, then next week we're going to be announcing the course officially and giving you the chance to join us for the first group of students to go through it. If you're watching it in the past, head to the show notes for this episode at musicalitynow.com, where we'll have full details. As always, we'll have links to everything mentioned in the show notes for this episode, including Greg's past interview here on the show and all of the references he mentioned for things like deliberate practice and flow and so on. All that remains is to say a huge thank you again to Greg for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.